Hi, this is Bob Weinberg. I'm an applicant for the TA1 position in PCR 2021. The workshop just ended. I had a wonderful time getting to know many of you, exchanging conversations and dialogues about how we can help our students learn the best, how we could teach them, how we can assist them in the learning. So this is a video I'm making. I looked at quite a few videos from the senior TAs, and they were very impressive, and I learned a lot, and I thought I'd contribute some more to the video teaching. So this video is going to be about institutional review boards and their primary mission of maintaining certain ethics in scientific research and protecting the rights and the welfare of human research subjects. I will start with a little bit of history. The institutional review boards, often called IRBs in the US, in some other countries, they may be called ethics review boards or committee on scientific ethics, but most countries do have a committee or a board that oversees all clinical research involving human beings to protect the subjects. So let me share my screen now. Okay, and let's see where my presentation is. Here we go. Slideshow from the beginning. So, as I mentioned, this is about institutional review boards and their ethical mission to protect the rights of human subjects in research studies. They're essential in the USA for any sort of research study involving human beings. And again, I'm Robert Weinberg, applicant for the TA1 position. So the functions and purposes, let me just minimize it myself, get this out of here. Functions and purposes of IRB. So the IRB is a committee whose primary mission is to protect the rights and welfare of human research subjects. In the USA, such a committee is called the Institutional Review Board, or IRB. In other countries, they may be called a Research Ethics Committee or Ethical Review Board. So in terms of how the IRBs are defined and their regulations, they're defined in the US by federal legislation under the Code of Federal Regulations, abbreviated CFR. And the CFR sets forth all the regulatory requirements of all federal laws in the USA. These are laws from taxation to education and IRBs and research. Now, IRB approval is required for any research with human subjects for studies that are subject to the authority of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, which also includes the U.S. Public Health Service, as well as the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, also called the FDA. Any drugs that are prescribed in the US for the treatment of a disease must be approved by the FDA, or such a drug is unlawful. So, in terms of a brief history of human subject experimentation and the role of the IRB. So, IRB can trace its roots internationally back in 1948 to the Nuremberg Code. This code evolved from the Nuremberg trials at the end of World War II. The Nuremberg trials included a trial of the primary political leaders of the Nazi empire or state, as well as there being the doctor's trials and the judge trials. So there are specific trials holding some of the highest professionals um, concerning what their role was in certain Nazi crimes against humanity, along with some of the inhumane medical research and atrocities done without the consent of prisoners who were maintained in the concentration camps. So the Nuremberg Code was formulated by the prosecution at the Nuremberg trials, and it articulated ethical standards to protect the fundamental rights of all human beings, which included requirements for voluntary and informed consent to participate in the research, a favorable risk benefit analysis. The whatever risks might exist should be outweighed by the benefits of that research, and the voluntary right to withdraw at any time without penalty, which of course was not the case for all the prisoners of the concentration camps. This was followed in 1964 by the Declaration of Helsinki. Um, it stated that it was morally binding on all physicians. It was a moral obligation that superseded any national, state, or local laws. So any physician who would violate the principles of Helsinki could not do so under the orders of any president or prime minister or dictator, because this was a morally binding code in terms of the physician's duties and obligations to his patients, or in this case, to the research subjects. So the Declaration of Helsinki was a cornerstone document on human research ethics, and it incorporated many principles that were first written out and articulated in the Nuremberg Code, which was written down and officiated by the World Medical Association. There are a number of tenets that are included within the Declaration of Helsinki. They include one, a fundamental principle of respect for the individual. Two, every person's right to self-determination. Three, every person's right to make informed decisions to partake or not to partake in research. This should be totally voluntary, and it's each person's decision. Four, the investigator's duty is solely to the patient or volunteer. It is not to any other organization, it is not to any other authority, but to the rights and welfare of the patient or volunteer. The subject's welfare, number five, must always take precedence. The subject's welfare, his well being. And number six, there was recognition that there are vulnerable populations which needed additional protections um, because of challenges or difficulties with them exercising their normal rights. And these, of course, included children, prisoners who are incarcerated, who have lost all their personal freedoms, and those who may be mentally incompetent or may have mental illness. NIH formed an ethics committee in the 1950s. There was a clinical research center established at the National Institute of Health. This was like a mini hospital within this federal research organization. And this clinical research center was there to investigate different human diseases, different therapies, and policy was set up that required all human research must be approved by an ethics committee. In 1964, the NIH director, James Shannon, established a policy that all research with human subjects, which were funded by the Public Health Service, and that falls under the US Department of Health and Human Services, all these studies funded by the Public Health Service must be approved by an ethics committee. So this was the early infancy in the development of IRBs in 1964. An article came out in 1966 in the New England Journal of Medicine. The title of this article was The Ethics of Clinical Research by Henry Beecher. And Henry Beecher was a professor of anesthesiology at Harvard Medical School at the time. And in this article, he described 22 different studies. These are scientific studies involving humans, which were conducted by respected investigators in their fields and also published in prestigious medical journals. And for each of the 22 studies, Beecher, with particularity, explained why the study conducted was unethical. And they were unethical based on such fundamental principles as lack of informed consent and or increased risk to the subjects without an appropriate benefit. And what he concluded, Dr. Beecher, is he demonstrated in this article then commonly accepted pervasive belief that the ends justify the means. That means for particular goals or objectives, it really does not matter what you do if the end is lofty. So if you have an end that may include the cure for some disease, it doesn't matter if you inject children or pregnant women with pathogens, but basically the ends justify the means, which was a philosophy espoused in the past. It was well developed and written extensively by Machiavelli. And whenever you're using this philosophy of the ends justifying the means, it's Machiavellian. So Henry Beecher concluded his article with, whoever gave the investigator the godlike right of choosing martyrs. So here it was the authors and the investigators who did this unethical research, but to them, it really wasn't unethical. It was a question of, it was for a good end, and we're going to go over some of those studies shortly. So whatever means was used was appropriate, they felt. So there are some US congressional hearings on human experimentation that followed public outrage and just general public upsetness about what they were hearing about some of these studies. And in 1973, Senator Edward Kennedy directed these congressional hearings in response to public concern over ethical problems in US medical research. Now, I'm going to give a sampling of some of these studies, but I'm not going to go in too much detail. The study that exactly preceded Senator Kennedy's congressional hearings was the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, which took place over a 40-year interval between 1932 and 1972 to study the natural history of untreated syphilis without the patient's consent. This took place in Tuskegee, Alabama. That's why it's called the Tuskegee syphilis experiment. And they had decided that initially there was no known cure or way to treat syphilis well in the 1930s. Later on, it was discovered that penicillin could treat it well, but they did not want to give these subjects in the study any penicillin. They wanted to see what would happen if you let syphilis grow in the human body for 40 years. And as I'm sure most of you are aware of the primary, secondary, and tertiary stages of syphilis, syphilis in the tertiary stage infects the brain. It causes delirium. It causes a type of madness. And very unfortunate endings to those who develop tertiary syphilis. And secondary syphilis also has its toll on a lot of morbidity on several organ systems. So here they felt, well, we need to know what happens to syphilis if you don't stop it. So we're going to subject, there were about 300 men involved in this experiment, and they all believed that when they were being called into the medical station, blood samples were being taken, they were having spinal taps, but all of this was to study the pathology of syphilis, the um, natural progression of syphilis in the body without treatment. And none of these 300 men were ever told that they were participating in this study. And so it was the natural history of untreated syphilis without the patient's consent. And this has become an international scandal, among several others we're going to briefly touch upon. Willowbrook was this children's sort of orphanage school. And at the time, it was known that hepatitis, this is hepatitis A, could be transmitted through something similar to an oral fecal route. And they wanted to study the transmission and epidemiology of hepatitis. And what they did, and this is with healthy children, they fed them food and water that was contaminated with hepatitis A intentionally. So they intentionally infected these children with hepatitis A and then studied its transmission among other children. Another US scandal is that at the Jewish Chronic Disease Hospital in New York, these patients at that hospital had some immune dysfunction, and they really wanted to study the effects of the immune system on cancer cells. So, without their knowledge, without their consent, they injected a number of patients with live cancer cells to see what would happen to the cancer cells in patients who are immune compromised. Another scandal, again, leading up to these congressional hearings, are the Milgram studies of obedience to authority. A number of psychologists and sociologists were trying to understand. This is following the end of World War II and disclosures of many atrocities committed by the Nazi soldiers and the Nazi scientists. And the question was, Hitler was at the top, and why was this blind obedience to authority? Why were everyone carrying out these awful atrocities? Because their manager, their leader said, you must do so. So Milgram took pairs of students in the study, and one of the students was being tested. The other, and the thing is, none of the students, they were recruited to do the psychological study, but the testers were not told that they were being studied psychologically, and those subjects being tested, it was explained to them when they saw a green light in front of them, which the other student couldn't see, they're supposed to start groaning and moaning and making faces. When they saw a yellow light, they were supposed to howl and yell a few times and kind of writhe, pretending that they were in some kind of discomfort. And when they saw the red light, they were supposed to scream and contort their bodies and appear really, really upset. So the other group of students did not know about these instructions. They sat in a controlled room and they were told, this is a study on negative conditioning, and it's instrumental for you to deliver an electric punishment. This was an electric shock in order to get the other group of students to follow certain instructions. Now, the other students were told at certain times they were not supposed to follow the instructions. And of course, the lights would get escalated from green to yellow to red. But the first group were told, now, if you give them the 10 to 20 volt shock, they may groan and yell a little bit. if you give them the 50-volt shock, they will be in much more pain. And then finally, they were shown the yellow zone on their shock delivering device. They said, if you move it up to this, it is a very severe electric shock that could result in death of the subject. But under all circumstances, you need to continue escalating the voltage of the shocks until the other student followed the instruction. So this was taped. There were videotapes, audio tapes, basically watching what the students who were doing the shocks would do. And it was really incredible, I mean, to the psychological community, that basically when they were commanded to do so, and this was their role in the experiment, the students, most of the students, I think all of the students, followed the instructions, and they continued to give more and more greater shocks until they got up to lethal range. And they watched the other students screaming and yelling and contorting their bodies. They did not know that this was an act, but they continued to deliver the 100-volt or 200-volt shocks if the other student did not follow instructions. So a Milgram study has been written up and analyzed many times. It's in many textbooks, but it goes to show that basically there are many ramifications of it. But one of the bottom lines is that people will commit any level of cruelty to other persons if they're told that this is what must be done, and in obedience to authority, they will carry that out. So this was kind of, you could say this was a rationalization for all the Nazi soldiers who put their prisoners into the gas chambers. They were being obedient to authority. This was their job. They weren't going, if they didn't carry out their job, they would be shot. Okay. Then we have our San Antonio contraception study. This was a study looking at the efficacy of certain oral contraceptives that were being developed in the early 1960s. And they took at this center a group of sexually active females. These were girls who were teenagers and in their 20s. And they came to partake in the study. Well, they usually got paid some fee. So everyone got $50 for each visit. And they were taking these pills that they were told would prevent pregnancy. Half the girls got the contraceptive being tested, and half got the sugar pill, the placebo. And as you can expect, many of the girls, none of them knew that they were in a study. None of them knew they were randomized to either control placebo group or the drug group. And whatever the efficacy was of the oral contraceptive being tested, you could bet there were many, many unwanted pregnancies in the other girls who got the placebo, because we know sugar pills do not prevent pregnancy. But they did not know they were participants in a study. Then we have the tea room trade study. I think the doctor's name was Holmes, Dr. Holmes. Anyway, he and his confederates, some graduate students and others, would hang out at particular service rest areas where it was general knowledge homosexuals would go there to those public restrooms to engage in anonymous sexual activity with other homosexuals. They were filming them. None of these men going there knew they were being observed or filmed. And some of the graduate students were copying down the license plate numbers of the cars that arrived, so they knew who they were, and later they identified their names and addresses. So they were studying homosexual behavior of this anonymous sexual activity. Then Dr. Holmes and his students, they went back, they looked up in the registry the names and addresses of these men, and they went to the men's homes basically to ask a number of questions. They did not specifically say how they got their name or address. They did not say they were studying homosexual behavior, but they were asking questions about their family size, their children, their upbringing. So they had a 30 to 60-minute interview. Then they went back to the university, and the men participating in these homosexual studies never knew they were part of an experiment. And then the paper came out in a journal. So the paper described the sociological um, customs and mores of these gay men who are having sex in these public bathrooms. And there were enough details about, they did not include the men's names, but there were enough details about them. So some of the men could be identified by their family members and by friends or associates. So these are some of the scandals that led up to Senator Kennedy's congressional hearings. So it led the following year to the enactment of the National Research Act of 1974. There was a public consensus at that point that federal oversight was really required to protect the rights and welfare of research subjects. Um, the Tuskegee experiment was one of the most scandalous and atrocious, but in general, many subjects were being exploited and harmed in the name of research. And again, remember Beecher's article that the ends justify the means. This was commonly accepted until the 1970s by many in the international research community. So in 1974, in response to the belief that human subjects were regularly being exploited and harmed on a regular basis during biomedical research, they established the National Research Act, and the National Research Act established the modern IRB system, along with the National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects of Biomedical and Behavioral Research. This was followed in 1978 by the Belmont Report, which summarized ethical guidelines and principles for research involving human subjects. So the Belmont Report summarized some of the ethical principles that we're going to discuss in some more detail shortly, and guidelines for research involving human subjects. These guidelines, of course, based on the principles. So the core principles included one, respect for persons. Each person has autonomy, and autonomy is a certain freedom to decide what your fate is going to be, to decide on your own destiny, and no person can be coerced into making a particular decision to partake in a research project or not. Two, beneficence. Now, as doctors, we've all taken the Hippocratic Oath. We know primum no nocere. Please excuse my Latin. I never studied Latin, but I know it means above all, do no harm. So in the Hippocratic Oath, Hippocrates knew that it was very important at times for different types of treatments to be applied, some treatments being more painful, more noxious to the patient, but you did not want to cause any kind of permanent organ damage or kill the patient just because you're treating him. The treatment cannot be worse than the disease. So number three, justice. Now, the ethical principle of justice focuses on the fair distribution of reasonable, non-exploitative treatment of persons. And we're going to get into that fair distribution shortly, but it basically means that research studies should not select certain groups to favor them. For example, you don't want to try some new, very beneficial drugs for cancer, HIV, just on wealthy subjects, all persons, regardless of their socioeconomic status, regardless of their race, regardless of their age, regardless of their religion, it should be fairly distributed when you choose your research subjects. Number four, informed consent to participate in research. So this also flows from the respect for persons, and we'll get more into informed consent. But what it means is before any subject decides to get involved with a research project, they must be told what are the risks and what are the possible benefits. But they must know if it's going to harm any of their organs. They need to know if there's a risk of some sort of permanent sequelae, a risk of infertility, or a risk of coma or death. So you cannot make informed consent unless you understand what the risks and the benefits are. And so, five, of course, we need to have an assessment of all the risks and benefits. And this is to each subject who you're approaching to partake in your study. And six, as we mentioned briefly before, the equitable selection of subjects with special guidelines for vulnerable populations. So vulnerable populations do not have the same capacity for thought and for decision as most adults, and they would include children or prisoners or mentally incompetent persons who may have some mental or psychiatric disease. So just going into a little more detail, Belmont, this is from the Belmont report, Belmont Principle 1, respect for persons. So all persons should be treated as autonomous agents. They're free to choose and free to decide. And persons with diminished autonomy must be given special protection. And these are the children, the prisoners, the women of childbearing age. So, from this principle one, respect for persons, there are four conditions that flow. Every person has a right to voluntarily consent to participate in a research project. Every person has a right to informed consent regarding the risks and the benefits before they participate in a research project. Every person has a right to protection of their privacy and the confidentiality of their personal data and their personal results. And every person has a right to withdraw from the project at any time, at any reason, and they should not be penalized for doing so. So, this beneficence is basically expanding on the right to individual autonomy and the right to self determination. So, each person has the right to determine her own destiny. Respect for persons with compromised ability to act autonomously. Um, Children, because of their legal status and immature intellectual development, they need protection before enrolling in any sort of study. Prisoners who are incarcerated and have forfeited personal freedoms, they may be more easily coerced, or undue influence may be expressed on them because they can't just walk out the door if they're not interested. Persons with limited educational background who may be unable to understand the effects of the study. So, if they never finished high school and they don't understand what kidney damage or heart damage or brain damage may be, they lack the capacity to have informed consent. And then sometimes the economic situation renders some persons susceptible to coercion or undue influence. When you're doing these research studies, you do not want to offer subject fees of $200 or $500 or $1,000, because what you'll find is persons who are jobless or homeless will feel undue influence from that larger fee to enter a study, even though they're afraid of it, even though they think it may harm them. They are being basically influenced by the amount of money, which is why IRBs always restrict the size of monetary award that can be given to subjects. You don't want to produce undue influence on certain persons where that fee may sort of force them to participate. So again, the coercion or undue influence limits the voluntariness of their consent. So we every time we do any kind of surgical procedure or treatment of a person, or we start a research study, we must get informed consent. Informed consent is a fundamental tenet of medical ethics. Whether participating in research or agreeing to some medical treatment, the subject or patient must understand the potential risks and benefits of such agreement. They must understand, can they have permanent heart damage? They must understand they may lose the ability to conceive children. The risks must be carefully explained before they can sign any kind of form of informed consent. For vulnerable populations such as children or the mentally incompetent, the investigator must use their substituted judgment. So, what is this substituted judgment? Well, if the investigator can be asked whether they would ask their own mother to participate in such a study, answering in the affirmative protects the subject. So if you ask the researcher, would you ask your mother to enroll in this study? If they say yes, then they, of course, most persons are very protective of their mothers. And if they're willing to enter their mother into the study, then it'll be fine for um, to enter these other subjects. But again, sometimes it's worded as ask the investigator if they themselves would enroll in this study, uh, would they take the drug or the intervention, or whether they would do so for their own mother. Okay, privacy and confidentiality. So, protection of privacy and confidentiality directly flows from the principle of respect for persons. So, this prevents the disclosure of potentially damaging or embarrassing information about a research subject. The OHRP, which is the United States Office of Human Research Protection, it's a federal agency, defines privacy thus: privacy is having control over the extent, timing, and circumstances of sharing oneself, either sharing oneself physically, behaviorally, or intellectually with other persons. Sharing is kind of like an open, exposing yourself, dropping your clothes, um, and you have control over when you want to do it, where you want to do it, and with whom you want to do it. So, privacy is another very important right of research subjects. Confidentiality of personal data and study results, it's somewhat close to, so privacy is a person's privacy regarding uh, their own bodies, and confidentiality is now going to extend this to um, certain protection of personal data. So again, the Office of Human Research Protection defines confidentiality as it pertains to the treatment of information that an individual has disclosed in a relationship of trust, and with the expectation that it will not be divulged to others, it will not be shared, it will not be communicated in ways that are inconsistent with the understanding of the original disclosure without their express permission. You cannot share data about their heart function. You cannot share their psychological test results without that person's permission and consent to do so. Now, personal identifying data, and this is, I'm thinking of that tea room study with the homosexuals, not only is it protected under these principles, but it's also protected in the US under the HIPAA Act. So the HIPAA Act prevents the disclosure of anyone's personal identifying data. In other words, name, phone number, address, email, anything that you can, their photo, anything that identifies them is protected by HIPAA. And there are very large penalties Some of the penalties are in the $5,000 to $10,000 range, um, and then there's sanctions against the hospital or the university. So Belmont Principle 2 is beneficence. So this principle of beneficence reflects the obligation to protect the welfare of the research subject and to secure their well-being. So again, this is consistent with the Hippocratic Oath's obligation, primum non nocere. While performing any kind of medical treatment on a patient, above all else, do no harm to the patient. Do not injure them. Do not cause any kind of organ damage. So the IRB must assure that the proposed research maximizes potential benefits while minimizing the potential risks of the study to the subject. So, beneficence, again, there are two questions the investigator may ask himself or herself to determine whether the research study satisfies this principle of beneficence. Are the research subjects treated the same way that he or she would like to be treated themselves in the situation? Or can the research investigator ask their own mother to participate in the study to undergo any proposed treatments or interventions or drugs? If the answers to these questions are yes, then the study satisfies the principle of beneficence. Other guidelines in attempting to satisfy this requirement of beneficence or principle of beneficence are the risks of the research justified by the potential benefits either to the individual subject himself or to society as a whole? Is the study designed to minimize the risks and maximize the benefits? A lot of times, this may involve using a lower dose of a new drug. If you know the drug has a potential of causing some renal damage in mice, you may want to start with lower doses when you first start to test them in phase 1, phase 2 trials of humans to minimize any risk of renal damage. Are there any conflicts of interest which may bias either the collection and interpretation of results or the conclusions of the study? That is why the IRBs often look down on persons with a financial interest in the study. For example, if you're one of the principal owners of a particular drug company and now you want to test that drug in some randomized controlled trial, well, you have skin in the game. In other words, um, if you have a financial, um, if you have some potential financial gain in the study going on, in other words, you want this drug to work, uh, that may influence some data that may be rejected, some data that are favored. Um, there may be some biased interpretation of results. There may be some bias in selection. So again, conflicts of interest which bias any part of the study, they're looked down upon by the IRB, and it's best to be a sponsor of a study where let's say CRO, a contract research organization, carries out this study rather than you carry out the study in your own facilities. Um, and of course, many times drug companies end up doing many of their studies in-house, which then calls up these conflicts of interest and their bias in the results. Belmont Principle 3 is justice. So the principle of justice, I'm sorry, principle of justice relates to the distribution of risk within society, and also this refers to the distribution of gains or benefits in society. So the potential risks of research should be equally borne out by all members of society who are likely to benefit from such research. If you're testing some drugs that may have a high risk of being harmful in some way, don't just select prisoners, don't just select children in orphanages. Uh, you need to be sure that you distribute the risk among several different types of groups, and don't select those groups that might be most prone to agreeing or prone to coercion or undue influence. And two, the research project does not systematically select certain classes or groups of individuals simply because of their availability, the convenience of finding or enrolling them, or any kind of compromise situation, such as they may be incarcerated. This is the important principle of justice. The principle of justice may exclude some of the following groups from specific research studies. It may exclude children from drug studies, which will only benefit adults. Here we don't even have any harm being considered, but if there's a drug being tested, which is only for adult patients and will never be used in children, um, you're violating this principle of justice if you're testing them in children when it's really only the adults will benefit. Women of childbearing age. Um, let's say you have a bad disease like HIV, and if you have economically advantaged HIV patients, they should not be preferred or selected over economically disadvantaged HIV patients. You don't want to have a drug that you'll only test in individuals who have more money or are more affluent to afford them. All groups should be tested, whether it's affordable or not. That should not be a factor. Again, in investigational drug studies, which could only be afforded by the affluent, that violates the principle of justice. And also, higher subject study fees, where you're paying persons to enroll in a study, where the disadvantaged may feel unduly influenced by that fee, which is why IRBs prevent higher participation fees in the studies. So those are many of the ethical principles we just reviewed. I'm just briefly going to mention there are three distinct IRB review categories that you select on your application for review. Very few studies meet the exempt category. Number one, exempt from further IRB review. It's a project which does not require further regulatory review. Often these involve paper studies, they're retrospective. So you do need IRB approval even to go through some patient records to look at outcomes from certain drugs being used, or if you have samples saved in a freezer, blood samples, even to test those, you need IRB approval. But again, the blood was already taken from the patient. There's no harm. They're sitting in a freezer. So, with minimal risk to the subject, you could test those blood samples. That kind of study would be exempt, meet the exempt category. Then, number two, we have an expedited review category. So, in the expedited review, these are many times performed either by the IRB chairperson or an experienced reviewer. Expedited review is also usually performed in those studies where there are minimal risks to subjects, not as minimal as the exempt category. So, in this case, we're not talking about blood samples in a freezer. If you're testing some new monitor and you may be putting a patch on the person's skin um, that is attached up to some kind of electrical transducer, there's very minimal risk in taking some readings by that instrument, as long as you know they're isolated from any shock risk. Um, so when there are minimal risks, and these would include studies that may require getting blood or urine samples from the subjects, studies in which they take some sort of mental or intellectual survey questions, questionnaires to be filled out. they're often completed on expedited review basis. But the vast majority of investigational devices and new drugs are going to go into category 3, the full committee review. We need to have a quorum of the IRB. That's a defined number of persons. It's often in the 5 to 7 person range. The whole committee reads all the documents, all the preclinical data, the studies done with animals, the studies done on cell lines. A lot of data is reviewed. I've sat on an IRB for 8 years. I reviewed about 300 clinical trials. And usually the documentation for the full committee review run anywhere from 150 to several hundred pages. So basically everything that is known on the drug seeking this IRB approval, from every animal it was ever tested in, any adverse reaction, any kind of nephrotoxicity, cardiotoxicity, pulmonary toxicity, every cell line it was tested on, the chemical structure of the drug, what is the mechanism of action. So the full committee review requires that the committee read through the entire document, the application with all this data, and they sit together and they discuss all the principles we went through about, they discuss informed consent, they discuss risk versus benefits of this possible treatment, who can benefit from the treatment, which patient groups does it apply to. And so I might want to also mention that IRB is critical for any study done on human subjects in the US. I believe most countries have similar laws, but the if you have a clinical study and you do not get IRB review, most of the national and international journals will refuse to publish any study that does not have IRB approval. And when you send off your manuscript for publication, there's a section where you need to give the name of the IRB that approved it, the address of the IRB that approved it, and the date it was approved by that IRB. All this needs to be subject to later inspection or examination. So you will not get a journal to publish your clinical trial if you did not get IRB approval. Also, you may lose all your NIH funding in the future, because if you do any clinical trial without IRB approval, you will basically be excluded from participating in any federally funded projects. And I have read a number of reports of some investigators who have been kicked out of their hospital. They've lost their staff privileges. Other investigators who have been kicked out of a university and they lost their faculty rank because of IRB violations, which are quite serious. And some physicians have even lost their medical license. So it's something you don't want to do without. You need to, you go through your standard processes of looking at your research question, deciding what kind of clinical trial you need to do, what your sample size is, how you're going to randomize, how you're going to blind. But then before you enroll your first subject, you must submit your entire clinical trial proposal to the IRB. If you don't do this, you will be dead in the water. Here are some of the references I used that you might be interested in looking at further. So there's Abder's and Bankert's Institutional Review Board, member handbook. And in fact, I've made this available. You can read it from my Google Drive. If you just click on the yellow link down here, you'll be able to have access to this book. Another book is Whitney's ebook, The Balanced Ethics Review, a guide for institutional review board members, from 2016. And again, there's a copy in my Google Drive. Just click on the yellow link below and you'll be able to read that at your leisure. And then we have the Western Michigan University. Many schools of medicine, many hospitals, many academic medical centers have their own version of IRBs, and here we have a Human Research Protection Program, the HRPP, and Institutional Review Board IRB Handbook of the Western Michigan Homer Stryker School of Medicine. So basically, they all say the same thing in different ways, but some people like to produce their own version for their own investigators. So I hope that this has been helpful in helping you understand the origins of ethical considerations for human experimentation and human research. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please feel free to look at any of these links, look at these references in my Google Drive. And I really have enjoyed working with you all. And I look forward to, I hope if I'm selected as a TA1 applicant, I look forward to working with you this year in the PPCR 2021. Thank you very much for all your attention. I hope you found this educational, and I'm going to try to make 2 or 3 videos each week to share some of my knowledge and expertise. And I'm still watching some of the videos you all made. I think there's something like 25 or 30 videos, and they're all wonderful. So I'm learning a lot too. Okay, thank you everyone, and I hope I'll see you in March. Ciao.